The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together, without coercion or conscription, bullying or bossiness.
Always whenever someone says, oh, peace and sausage, and it's a roll and sausage, and this sausage roll, we're better together.
Well, they didn't. It was us. We invented it, just like every other bloody thing.
Well, that's very interesting.
We have very serious the referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, if you've been fed up with most of the debate until now, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland. Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast number 5. And today we've got the second part of the conversation with Donald Adamson, who teaches political economy at the University of Cambridge and also sociology at the Open University. It was a really fascinating discussion. I think there's a lot there to get your teeth into, so I hope you enjoy it, and we'll have a wee word at the end. We just go straight into it this time, so be ready. If we go back to the more economic side of it, there's, with the SNP for example, they're late with Salmond being an ex-banker, and they're often labelled the tartan Tories, particularly from Labour. They've often been labelled that, whereas everyone knows it's a bit of a crock, because it's quite clear that although they're by no means leftist, the SNP's policies have been for a while considerably to the left of New Labour, and in fact Labour have in a certain sense replaced the Tories as the right-wing party in Scotland, with all the corruption and sleaze that goes along with being the right-wing party in the country. Yeah. But given a yes independence vote, what kind of economic systems can come in with the parties that currently exist or independently of the parties that currently exist?
Well, I'm not sure I'd wholly accept the premise in your question that the SNP is to the left of Labour. I think in some areas, perhaps that's true in some areas of social policy. I think on economic policy, I don't think there's a great deal between the SNP and Labour. I'd also say that I'm as up as anybody else is for ridiculing Scottish Labour, but I think we do need to recognise that there are still some decent people left in Scottish Labour. People who are conceivably capable of being persuaded to support independence. But as far as the economic system is concerned, and I think one way to think about capital is that it's an economic system in which we produce goods and services for the capitalist, in exchange for which the capitalist provides us with a wage, so that we can buy back from the capitalist the goods and services that we produce for him in the first place. And I think there's certainly among many on the left in Scotland, there's a willingness and an ambition to challenge that. And I suppose the question then is, how do we challenge that, given the historical failure of social democracy in Europe, a failure that even dates in the early decades before the early decades of the Second World War.
When you say a failure, do you mean the failure of it to take control of the system, or are you talking about countries that nominally at least have a social democratic system, like Norway and Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, who generally seem to be doing better than some of the other countries in Spain or Italy, for example?
Sure. Yeah. Now, what I'm thinking of more specifically is going back to the early generations of social democrats in Germany in the 19th century. And many of them were people who saw social democracy as a means of creating the conditions for socialism. Of course, before we go very far into the 20th century, in the early decades of the 20th century, social democracy has already started to decline into a means of managing capitalism. And of course, social democracy continued its decline thereafter. In many respects, Keynesianism, what we call Keynesianism, only underlined that. And it was only a matter of time, given the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971, before Keynesianism itself collapsed. And I suppose what I'm anticipating, and certainly what I'm hoping for in an independent Scotland, is that the although I'm not a social democrat myself, as I think I said before, I'm hoping that the left in Scotland after independence embraces a progressive social democratic agenda with the objective of getting back to those early origins of social democracy, consciously seeing social democracy as a means of creating the conditions for socialism.
As a stepping stone to something better.
Well, sure, and I think this is important obviously in the history of capitalism as well. This failure of social democracy. I suppose that does introduce lots of different areas. How you mentioned Sweden, and you could also discuss Denmark. I mean, Denmark, although it has a lighter regulation or regulatory regime on say labour, Denmark, like Sweden, does have a very strong corporatist tradition. Trade union densities of over 80% in some of the Scandinavian countries. Compare that to Scotland, about 25%, and most of that is concentrated in the public sector. And in Scotland, of course, public sector trade unionism is very much the last bastion, the last defence of trade unionism. And of course, if Scotland does stay in the union after 2014, obviously let's hope that doesn't happen, I think one of the areas that, particularly the Tories, but it may happen under Labour as well, will target is to weaken public sector trade unions. If that happens, obviously, that opens the way for a new wave of labour legislation, or anti-labour legislation, anti-trade union legislation. And I think Scotland could find itself, this would be another area where Scotland would find itself in an increasingly precarious position. But in terms of the kind of economy I would envisage, I suppose it would be broadly what's understood as a progressive social democracy. I don't think there can be any return to Keynesianism, though. Maybe it might be helpful to say a few words about Keynes, because I think his general theory is still highly relevant for us. But we need to be very careful to distinguish Keynes's arguments in the general theory from what we call Keynesianism. What Keynes effectively did in the general theory was to demolish much of classical economic theory. After all, one of the reasons he used the title general theory was to communicate his argument that the model that he developed in the general theory was a model that would be generally applicable to a wide set of economic circumstances. But the corollary of that argument was that classical theory was a special theory, that it was applicable only to a very specific set of economic conditions. And what happened under Keynesianism, under the so-called neoclassical synthesis, and maybe we could discuss that on another occasion, but this was effectively inverted. As Keynesianism developed under mainstream economics, Keynes's general theory became the special theory, and neoclassical orthodox mainstream economic theory was reinstated as the general theory. And what Keynes recognised, or one of the things he recognised in the general theory, was that capitalism was subject to periodic crises. And one of the causes of this, and one of the factors that amplify these crises, Keynes argues in the general theory, was what he called the marginal efficiency of capital. It's a very important concept in the general theory, and Keynes puts it to a number of different uses in the general theory. A simple definition of the marginal efficiency of capital would be it's the rate of profit that the capitalist expects from applying a capital asset to produce output, the income stream on investment, if you like. And of course Keynes recognised that as speculation became a larger and larger component of capital flows, so the marginal efficiency of capital became more and more unstable, more and more uncertain. Hence Keynes's well-known point in the general theory, where he tells us when the capital development of a country becomes the byproduct of the activities of a casino, the job is ill done, and the job he's referring to is capital investment, or more pedantically, capital investment that's conducive to full employment.
So what do you think is the gap in the public conception of the Keynesian solution to that, and what the Keynesian solution actually is?
Well, I think Keynesianism became instituted as a kind of deficit bias, and what used to be called left Keynesians were just as responsible for this as in Britain's case the UK Treasury. And I think some of the more engaging passages of the general theory, and then this gets back to your earlier question about the kind of economic system in independent Scotland, is where Keynes talks about the need for what he calls the socialisation of investment, because for Keynes, in a normal functioning capitalist economy, it would be optimal for somewhere between 65 to 75% of capital investment to be socialised, and for the remainder to be in the private sector. If you think about that, what we're actually saying here is, because we have to remember that Keynes was an apologist for capital. The general theory was written to save capitalism, or at least to save capitalism from itself. And I think the lesson for the Scottish left here is that here we have one of the arch apologists of capitalism telling us that we need to socialise investment in a capitalist economy in order to reduce the severity and regularity of capitalist crises. Because that, for Keynes, the key point here is that by socialising investment, you reduce the amplitude, the instability of the margin, you stabilise the marginal efficiency of capital, and it's precisely that process, and there are a lot of complex and convoluted processes that flow from that, the impact on interest rates and the impact on supply price and so on. But the overall impact is to stabilise capital. But of course, this is capitalist crises.
So this is one of the ideas you would like to see implemented as a step towards something else in an independent Scotland, or?
Well, this is one of the ideas that, again, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier with Eric Olin Wright and Real Utopias. I think one of the projects for the left more broadly, and for the Scottish left more specifically, is to create the conditions for capitalism by creating alternative relations of production within capitalism itself. Because what the left can learn from capitalism is learn from its success. What capitalism has succeeded in doing is naturalising its own relations of production. So competition has been naturalised, money making has been naturalised, the relentless cycle of working long hours for a wage, and of course mass consumption has been naturalised, and so deeply embedded is this naturalisation of capitalist relations of production that many people can't even imagine an alternative to it. I think Slavoj Žižek put it quite well when he said, it's much easier to imagine the end of all life on earth than it is to imagine a much more modest, radical change in capitalism. And I think he's right. I think for many people, even on the left, it's very difficult to imagine this more radical change in capitalism. And that's why I would put much more emphasis, as I say, as part of the project for the left more broadly, and the Scottish left more specifically, ideally after independence, in developing this, creatively developing the means to create alternative relations of production within capitalism itself. And that's how I would think of the socialisation of investment as one means of doing that. It's not a panacea any more than radical monetary reform is. I mean, I'd love to see the Scottish left distance itself from this whole greedy bankers narrative. Or put it this way, if we must talk about greedy bankers, let's not talk about greedy bankers in terms of the ephemera of bankers' bonuses and remuneration packages. If we're going to talk about greedy bankers, let's address the reality that a small number of large banks, effectively multinational corporations, have a virtual monopoly of the supply of credit.
Well, this is Bertolt Brecht. What is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank?
Yes, yeah. But that's the kind of greedy banking we should be addressing, and not the ephemeral fluff, if you like, of bankers' bonuses, because ancient Rome had a highly developed banking system. They were no strangers to greedy bankers. The same with Renaissance Florence.
I mean, the greedy bankers thing, changing the big bonuses, is kind of equivalent to getting shot in the head 5 times instead of 6 times effectively.
Sure, yeah.
With that kind of system.
Yeah, and as I say, the left also mustn't buy into this myth that monetary reform, even radical monetary reform, is some kind of panacea. And how I would fit monetary reform, radical monetary reform, into my thinking on this would be, again, to reiterate the point, to see radical monetary reform as part of the creating these alternative relations of production within capitalism itself. Because one of the reasons that socialism does seem so utopian to so many people is because it appears to be an abstraction from reality rather than being grounded in the reality that we experience in our day-to-day lives.
So when you're saying it's difficult to imagine another system, like the idea of having one country moving in a socialist direction, one of the arguments that's always given against it in the simplest terms is, well, you're pissing against the wind, and you can't piss against the wind because the world's all moving in this direction. Like in Greece, where they've got the crisis, and there's the radical left that are trying to get voted in, there's the radical right. Yeah. And it's always, you can't have the radical left because it will destroy all of the world markets. How real do you think that is?
Well, again, it comes back to the point that the best way to challenge this naturalisation of capitalist relations of production is to create alternative relations of production within capitalism. We're not going to make what we were discussing earlier, the great leap to socialism. It may happen. There may be a workers' revolution globally, but it's very unlikely. I don't think even a lot of Marxists are sitting on the edge of their seats waiting for that. But you mentioned Sweden and other countries earlier, which have broadly been seen for some time now as progressive social democracy. We do need to remember, social democracies rather, we do need to remember that in countries like Sweden and Norway, the development of social democracy in those countries in the late 19th century was coterminous with the winning of the franchise, with universal suffrage. And it's a very important distinction between social democracy in mainland Europe as well and Britain. The origins of British social democracy are quite different. And that historical legacy, I think, has informed the history of the Labour Party in the 20th century. But you thinking about countries like Sweden and Denmark and Germany as well, for that matter, what we have witnessed in the 20th century are different models of capitalism, as well as different models of social democracy. Now, it's true that the European social model has been under increasing stress, and it's in fact it barely exists today. But we are obviously in an era of, if you like, of second wave neoliberalism, and I think the extent to which the left in Scotland will be able to resist that will be decided after 2014. I think if Scotland remains in part of the UK, I think the prospects for the left in Scotland themselves are going to be very bleak, and apart from the prospects and the future for the Scottish working class. If, however, Scotland becomes independent, I think there is that alternative future that's available to us, which I would argue only independence can deliver. I don't think the British are ever going to deliver this.
Okay. One of the ways that many people hope that a move to the left can happen is as we move away from an oil economy and onto a more renewables-based economy. But this is very interesting, both politically and economically and culturally in Scotland at the moment, because a lot in the independence movement we're saying, no, we're going to be rich, look at all this oil. And we're also saying, but we've got all this renewable power as well. And the world has to move in one direction. There's not really any choice about where we have to go. Personally, I think that one of the interesting things about this in general, not just Scotland, is that one of the reasons we're not moving to our green economy as fast as we need to be and build the massive infrastructure that we need, one of the reasons we're not doing it quickly enough is because it's harder for the capitalists to find justifications to say, I own the wind, I own the sun. It's harder for them to close off that little bit of the commons than it is to say, I own this oil well that you can't see or you can't feel on your face. I know it seems a bit kind of romantic way to look at it, but I think it's one of the reasons we're not moving in that direction quickly enough. But there's this kind of strange almost hypocrisy in Scotland with we're green, we're rich, we've got all this oil, we're rich. And where do you think this stands? So if Scotland becomes independent, we could be at the behest of the oil companies, or we could be moving in this green environmental direction, or a bit of both. Where do you think this would come out in an independent Scotland? Well,
I think if you were to look at this through the prism of the SNP, I think to coin a phrase, I think they clearly do want the best of both worlds. I mean, one of the things about oil, it is true, of course, that the present prices, and there's every reason to believe that oil prices will, if anything, will increase in future decades, particularly given the rate of growth of China and other BRIC countries. Oil is valued at about £1.5 trillion, and that's a huge resource. But of course, what we have to remember is if Scotland is going to exploit those reserves in the future, many of those oil fields are increasingly risky, and of course they become increasingly costly as they become increasingly risky. If oil prices should fall, then clearly those fields are not going to be developed. But where I would stand on oil is I'd be quite happy to leave all the oil that's present in the North Sea. That's probably not a very popular thing for anybody who supports independence to say, but it seems to me that there's a huge contradiction in the SNP's agenda, and it's clear that the SNP does subscribe to a growth agenda. No difference between the SNP, Labour and the Tories there. But they also want to embrace this kind of cosmetic greening of policies and the way that they've embraced the possibility of renewables. And that seems to me a circle that can't be squared, to fall back on oil reserves, which will need to be exploited for the next 3-4 decades and until the field's reserves are exhausted, whilst at the same time advocating the greening of policy. That doesn't make sense to me. But I appreciate that's not going to be a very popular opinion with what we might call mainstream nationalist opinion, but I don't think I don't think the left should be here to placate mainstream nationalism.
But to touch on what you're saying before, do you think like not the greening of policy, but an actual shift to a renewable economy could bring about the kind of, so in Scotland particularly, or in the world in the grander scale, do you think that a move to the more green economy could bring about some of the changes you would like to see? Oh,
definitely. We have to wean ourselves off the growth agenda. Capital is reaching the limits of its growth. I think we touched on this earlier, that Britain's a good example of that. Britain has been in crisis since the late 1960s. British capital's response, as well as global capital's response to that, has been to adopt a neoliberal agenda, adopt globalisation, promote financialisation. These are not accidents of history. These are capitalism's response to the crisis that has been developing in the late 1960s. And I think, although obviously capital will try to sell itself as being able to adopt this green agenda, particularly with renewables, and to make that consistent with the growth agenda, again, there are so many inconsistencies there, and I don't think the left should buy into this kind of narrative, or whatever you want to call it, at all. But as far as renewables are concerned, clearly the costs of investment are huge just now, and obviously one of the arguments against independence is that Scotland needs to remain part of the UK in order to enjoy the economies of scale that being part of the UK would provide as far as renewable investment is concerned. But of course, what we need to acknowledge is Scotland has already attracted a lot of inward investment, and there's no reason to believe that won't continue. And again, it's not to idealise the future or romanticise the future. It's something that the left must always resist, and of course it is an instinct, not just on people on the left, but on anyone who takes a future-oriented perspective. Which, of course, with independence you must. I think it's one of the radical differences between the Yes campaign and the No campaign is the No campaign is very much defending the past and a very distorted perspective on the present and the near future, whereas I think the Yes campaign is very much oriented to the future for democracy, the development of Scotland's economy, and also to address many of the social and economic issues that have been exacerbated in Scotland precisely because Scotland has been part of the UK, particularly over the last 4 decades since neoliberalism really kicked into in terms of its effects in Scotland.
I'm sure many of the SNP members or policymakers would suggest that, just on the same point, that the idea would be to take the oil money in the short term in order to build the green economy in the long term.
Yeah, I mean it's a kind of constant refrain from many in the SNP, that we have this resource. Why would we leave this? Why would we be the only country in the world to leave this resource in underwater? It's a compelling argument in many ways, because clearly it is a huge resource, and it will yield returns to Scotland, for an independent Scotland, for several decades into the future. And of course, I suppose you could argue as well, which I think the SNP does argue, that the resources from oil could be allocated to an oil fund. And clearly Scotland's in no position, and is never going to be in any position to rival the oil fund that a country like Norway has. But again, that's no excuse not to start one now, and that those resources could be used to finance a lot of inward investment in renewables in Scotland. But again, that strikes me as being perverse, to use a dirty energy production and consumption to finance clean energy production and consumption. That just doesn't make sense.
Okay. Another interesting aspect in this is there's a lot of young voters in Scotland, and we talked earlier about how it's a very generational thing. You'll find that younger Scots are very pro-independence, whereas older Scots, the wartime generation, tend to be less so. But there's a new generation coming in, where the new cohort, I think.
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
So these people are new voters, floating voters, that are just beginning to vote, and also with the possible 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds voting. I did some research for this recently, and there are only about 3 countries in the world where 16-year-olds can vote.
Sure.
There's a few where 17-year-olds can vote, and there is one where 16-year-olds can vote, but only if they go with their parents, which I thought was quite funny. I can't remember which one it was. But it's kind of like going to an 18 film or something. You can go if you go with your dad.
Sure.
But it's a bit bizarre. But how do you think this is going to affect the picture?
Well, I think new cohorts do form an important part of any electorate, and I think this will be no more true than in the independence referendum. I mean, there are 2 types of new cohorts: the electoral new cohorts, if you like, people who are newly enfranchised with each general election. But more broadly, the new cohorts are those first 3 generations of new electoral new cohorts who haven't yet developed voting patterns and haven't developed loyalties to any, or many of them haven't developed loyalties to any political party. And in the case of the independence campaign, to any particular campaign. And one of the reasons this constituency is so important, apart from the fact that they comprise almost a quarter of the total Scottish electorate, even though they do historically have a lower propensity to vote.
Though the quarter is a high number.
But even with a lower turnout of around 50%, that's still round about 450 to 550,000 voters. So the campaign that can win a majority of that number of votes is going to be in a very good position to win the referendum. But one of the reasons that new cohorts are so important is because with many new cohorts, what they tend to do, and there's an awful lot of research on this, is they tend to remain undecided until very late in the stages of an election campaign, or in case of the independence referendum, the independence referendum campaign. And what they're waiting for, many of them, is waiting to see which side, which party or which campaign is going to form a winning coalition in the election. There's a very important objective there for both campaigns, but I think particularly for the Yes campaign, given the point you made that many younger voters, obviously not all of them, many younger voters are certainly more receptive to the arguments for independence. And again, many younger voters are more future oriented than more established cohorts. And again, it's similar to the difference between the broad difference between the Yes and No campaigns. The Yes campaign, I think, is broadly more future oriented. The No campaign is much more oriented to defending the past. The key objective one of the key objectives for the Yes campaign is to try to win, or should be to try to win, a majority of these new cohorts. Bear in mind also that depending on which opinion poll you believe, somewhere between 15 to 20% of voters currently are undecided in Scotland. They're not committed to one side, one campaign or the other. I think that's good news for the Yes campaign, given that we've been through a festival of Britishness in 2012, an ongoing festival of Britishness. The fact that there's still 1/5 of the Scottish electorate who are open-minded enough, sceptical enough, however you want to put it, about Britishness to not be decided and how they're going to vote in 2014 is very important I think more important for the Yes campaign than for the No campaign.
I hate throwing in, there's always, in this kind of discussion, there's always the kind of, and we need an internet question now, and I don't like this, the standard thing in an academic course. We have all the questions about politics, and we need some kind of internet question.
Right.
But I hate doing that, but do you think that the Yes vote or the kind of SNP Yes campaign have a step ahead on the internet? And I don't know how often you're there. I don't use Facebook, but like independence and Yes is all over Twitter. The No campaign seems to be most strongly represented by George Fultz, which is a permanent boost for the Yes campaign. There's too many brilliant bloggers to mention, but the Yes campaign seems to have a real step ahead in the social media at the moment.
I mean, I think you have to obviously be careful to kind of remove any or try to distance yourself from any internal bias here. But I think broadly the impression I get is that limiting the perspective to the blogosphere is that the pro-independence blogs seem to be much more enlightened than the anti-independence blogs, the unionist blogs, whatever you want to call them. And I think that reflects something that's actually much deeper, because there's, again, a much greater left orientation in the Yes campaign's blogs as well. One of the things I think it does, the deeper things it reflects, is there is a desire, I think, a growing appetite for democratic change in Scotland. And it's obvious where much of this is coming from. You know, in Scotland we've been used for so long now to getting the government that we vote for maybe 2 or 3 times in a generation, if we're lucky. And clearly that's not how democracy, even liberal democracy, works in other countries. In other countries, the majority of voters get the governments that they vote for in every single general election, not just 2 or 3 times in a generation as in Scotland. I think broadly it will be interesting to see what an independent Scotland does with this kind of newfangled concept that the rest of the world knows as democracy, because I think it's going to be a novelty to a lot of people in Scotland. It's not something we're used to. You know, you vote and you get the government that you vote for.
Wow.
But I think obviously for the left, and I think looking at some of the blogs, left-oriented blogs in Scotland, there's a much more ambitious agenda than simply a change of personnel. It's much deeper than that. And I think, again, this feeds into some of the things we were talking about previously, that I think there is not only a growing appetite for democratic change in Scotland, I think there is a growing recognition that independence is the only way we're going to get democratic change in Scotland. Whether it's a true democratic transformation, maybe it's important not to overstate this point, because I think it will take some time, but I think just liberating ourselves from the British state and the undemocratic practices and institutions of the British state will be a democratic transformation in itself.
Do you think, as well as a democratic transformation, there's going to be a demographic transformation? Because in part we've been told that, you know, with an independent Scotland, all these hundreds of thousands of people are going to go back to Scotland, and there should also be different rules about immigration. The immigration policy has a lot of problems, things like Dungavel is a permanent embarrassment.
Sure.
But do you think, as well as the democratic situation, the demographic situation might change?
Well, if you listen to the No campaign, independence will bring capital flight, mass migration from Scotland.
But all the terrorists are going to come.
And the terrorists as well, yeah. That's an important point, the point you make about demographic change and the impact of independence on the demographics of Scotland. Because, again, we were talking earlier about how Scotland urgently needs its own migration policy. And I think one point we didn't make, of course, is that the UK is currently adopting a closed-door policy on immigration. And given that Scotland was disadvantaged when the UK had a relatively open policy on migration, attracting such a low proportion of UK migrants, I think people in Scotland need to think about how Scotland is going to be affected when the UK adopts this, as it is, this closed policy of migration. It's going to have a pretty devastating impact in Scotland, not just in the next couple of years, but for the next 2, 3, 4 decades, at precisely the time when a Scottish government should be instituting its own migration policy geared to attracting more young skilled migrants to Scotland, among other things. So I think that's, that demographic change is important. Whether thousands or hundreds of thousands of Scots will come back to Scotland from after independence, I think remains to be seen. I think obviously you have to be very careful. One of the reasons that I think I would emphasise that Scotland needs a managed migration policy is because clearly you need to have the infrastructure in place in order to absorb an increase in migrants. And one of the things that I think is noticeable in terms of England's experience, and I think we did touch on this earlier, about how England's experience of migration, particularly in the post-war period, is very different from Scotland's. One of the things we need to note is that migration does affect different people, different classes in different ways. And for a well-to-do middle-class family, a migrant is a potential employee, a cleaner, a nanny, a gardener. But for many working-class communities in England, a migrant is someone who will potentially undercut wages, maybe even take their job away. And of course, the Tories and New Labour have been playing this card. One of the reasons, I think we said earlier, Ed Miliband went to Peterborough was because places like Peterborough in England have been captured by the Tories. They've also been affected by the racial tensions that the far right, the BNP and the English Defence League have been conducting for several decades.
Oh, don't worry, George Galloway's here to sort it all out.
Well, sure, I don't think even George could sort this out. But the point is, when Ed Miliband made the point in his speech that New Labour got its immigration policy wrong, what he was effectively saying to Peterborough and places like it, and particularly in the east of England and the south of England, is that if Labour gets back into power, it will be just as tough on immigration as the Tories are. That's the only way that Labour can win back these Tory voters and these white working class communities, some of whom, not all of whom obviously, some of whom have turned to the far right. And I think the only way that any political party in England can appeal to the far right, obviously, is by being tougher on immigration and being seen to be tough on immigration. The consequences of that, of course, for immigrants and migrants themselves are pretty bleak, because it will, although it's not the intention of Labour or even the Tories for that matter, it will inflame racism in England. There's no question about that. That's what it's been doing for several decades now. That's why many of these communities are such fertile territory for the far right. So before Scotland accepts an influx of migrants, even a relatively small influx, we need to make sure we have the infrastructure in place, and that's why a managed migration policy is very important. Otherwise, Scotland could find itself going through what many communities in England have gone through.
That infrastructure wouldn't only involve housing stock. Things like if you're talking about capital investment from the government, that's one of the ways that an independent Scotland could be seen to be like a beacon. You can come and you're not going to get crap wages, and you're not going to get put in a shit house, and you're not, this is one of the ways that there could be a population increase, a managed immigration policy, helping Scotland's population, and being like a progressive beacon, I think.
That's what Sweden has done. Sweden has seen a significant increase in its population in the last 12, 13 years. Okay, Sweden doesn't have a bona fide social democratic government in place anymore, but nevertheless, it still has many of the policies intact. The corporatism is still there, the welfare state is still there, and in spite of that, or because of that, Sweden has attracted more people to Sweden. And again, compare that to Scotland's experience. Scotland's population has barely shifted in the whole post-war period. And again, that's part of the price that Scotland has paid for being part of the UK. But for me, the most compelling argument for independence is what we were discussing earlier. Independence would start the process, and it would only start this process of disengaging Scotland from British economic imperialism and the ongoing crisis management of the British state and British capitalism.
Okay, excellent. And a very short final question. How are you going to celebrate if we win?
Well, actually, one of my best friend in Edinburgh died 2 years ago of cancer. It was a huge shock to all of us. And we used to have discussions about independence and devolution. He wasn't he didn't share a lot of my politics, did share some of them, but he was certainly much more sympathetic to independence than some other friends. Less so nowadays, of course. But anyway, one of the things I would do is, because he loved to take his dog up Arthur's Seat, and luckily my sister lives in the shadow of Arthur's Seat, so on the morning after independence I would take a bottle of whiskey up Arthur's Seat and drink it, and that would be one way I would definitely celebrate independence. There would be other celebrations as well, but I would do that for my mate Rob. That's definitely number one.
Okay, thanks very much, Donald Adamson.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure.
So there you go. That was great, wasn't it? It's always a pleasure to listen to someone who knows what they're talking about, so it must have been good for him to meet me. No, sorry, I'm joking. I couldn't resist that one. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks. For our first 4 episodes, at the time I'm recording this, we've already had way over 2,000 listens, so thanks to all of you for listening. All of the retweets and Facebook likes and everything that you've been doing is great. Please keep it up. Try and tell another person about the podcast. If you've got anything you'd like to contribute, please let me know. If there's someone you think I should speak to, let me know about that as well. To finish today, we've got the Workers song by Dick Gaughan, who kindly let us use it. This song was also the request of Donald Adamson. So hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll speak to you next time.